Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I must apologise. I have just got off a plane to New York, so I'm going to walk around the stage a little bit to keep myself lively, and also to take your attention off the fact I don't actually have a presentation for you. I've seen Andrew present before, and I've seen Sue present before, and I thought, how do I possibly follow that, right? So the advantage of going last, and very much least in the company of these two, is that I get to sort of riff off some of the things that they've been talking about. So I am going to talk to you a little bit about content and about change. But I work for the Economist group, and there are two things that I get asked almost every single day. And contrary to popular opinion, the first is not, Nick, why do you dress like you want to be an Italian Premier League football manager? That is not one of them. Although I notice the purple ties are very much of the moment, so that's good. The two questions that I get asked, one isn't particularly relevant to what we're talking about today, and that is print dead? And just to put that one to the side, it's not. It's changing, like everything, but it's not dead. The second is, in a world where everybody wants to talk about this shift from advertising to content, should brands be thinking of themselves less as advertisers and more as publishers? Now, of course, that's interesting when you work in the publishing business, right? Because we know a lot about publishing, and it's a hard business to be in. And I thought I would just spend a few minutes talking to you about my perspective on that, because I think it's a really interesting area. Now, I expect you are thinking I'm going to give you a definitive answer. But I work at The Economist, and economists, not that I am an economist, but economists are well known for saying the answer to everything is it depends. So the answer to should brands become publishers is it depends. But that, I think, is interesting in and of itself. And the reason for that is, and let me unpack it for you, is not because I don't believe in the value of content. I think that content has an extraordinary role to play in creating brand engagement. And I think there are lots of ways in which content not just outperforms advertising in creating brand engagement, but is also redefining it. And let me just explore that for a little minute for you. The first thing that I think content does that advertising really struggles to do is to create value through utility. And I think we live in a world where utility or brand utility is increasingly important. We have infinite choices about the brands and products that we buy. And branding has to go from being just an exercise, a means in and of itself. It has to go to be an end. It has to create some value and some utility. And I think content is a much more suitable medium for creating utility. Let me give you an example of that, and it's an example as you'd expect from the company I work for, but we have the pleasure of working with GE, and we run a content program with GE called Look Ahead. And that content program has generated over the last 18 months 1,000 pieces of original content around the area of innovation. 1,000 pieces of content in 18 months. GE Look Ahead has become not the, but a definitive place to go and find content around innovation, around global business decision making. It's a really interesting change in the way that the communication paradigm works for GE, and it's all about creating utility. It's difficult to imagine how you could create that level of utility through advertising alone. So content leads, in my view, when it's done well, to utility. The second thing that I think content does particularly well, in contrast or potentially in addition to advertising, is create belonging. Now, belonging is interesting because belonging is a fundamental human need. We all have a sense of wanting to belong to something. And I think increasingly, brands have to embrace this idea that it's not just a transactional relationship with their consumers, it's about creating a sense of belonging. And content does that because potentially it's a much richer experience. And I'll give you an example of a brand that I think is harnessing content in a way that's creating belonging that goes well beyond anything they were ever able to do in advertising. Not sure how many people in this room would be aware of the brand Patagonia. It's an outdoor clothing brand. Absolutely extraordinary business. And it is going through a period of extraordinary growth. And actually, that extraordinary growth is not necessarily being driven by the innovations within the business, although there are many. It's actually being driven by, to some degree, a change in the way it communicates. Patagonia is a company that is characterized by an extraordinary sense of purpose and mission. But that's very difficult to communicate purely through the means of advertising. Instead, increasingly, they're looking to content as a way of telling the Patagonia story. And if any of you are particularly interested in see how this works in practice, I would encourage you to go to patagonia.com right now and read the story that they've written about the certified down that they use in all of their clothing. It's quite extraordinary to understand the process that they go through to make sure that every piece of clothing that they produce, the feathers or down that are used in that clothing, is not as a result of force-fed or live-plucked birds. It's a quite extraordinary story, but it's very sophisticated and very nuanced and very complicated, and something that's almost impossible to communicate through advertising alone. And if you do go and you do read it, I think you'll find it extraordinarily difficult as a result not to feel a sense of connection or belonging to that brand. That's the second thing. The third thing, and Andrew talked a little bit about this, is about participation. We live in a world now where we've gone from passive consumption of broadcast media to an active participation in social media. And I think every one of us in this room, and the John Lewis ad is a good example, would understand that content, there is increasingly a grey line between those two things. But nevertheless, content is something that we feel much more confident or comfortable sharing. Now, Red Bull is an example that gets used of how you can create participation in content, and I'm not going to use that. But Converse, another really interesting brand, whose commitment to creating content around music has led to an extraordinary pickup in its social presence. Converse now has 50 million likes on Facebook, and to Andrew's point, it's not just about how many you've got, it's about the level of participation. So I think content as a medium, either in addition to or as an alternative to advertising, is extraordinarily powerful. The thing for me, though, is it is not a panacea for the challenges that we now have around creating brand engagement. It is a tool, another tool in a toolbox. It has some problems of its own. It's difficult to scale at times. It requires significant investments. And thirdly, it requires a whole new skill set. And the thing that worries me as we talk about this change from a world that's driven by advertising to one that's increasingly driven by content is we fall into the same old trap we've always fallen into, which is it's about quantity. It's about more. But I think intrinsically we all know that actually, like most things in life, quality trumps quantity most of the time. So when I come back to this question that I get asked a lot by our clients, by agencies, people look at The Economist and say, well, you're a publisher. Should we be trying to emulate you? Should we be moving into a world where all brands see themselves as publishers? And my answer, as you know, is it depends. And I have a three-pronged test that says, as a brand, should you be thinking about not just creating content, because I believe that all brands should be thinking about creating content, but should you be thinking about becoming a publisher? And the three-pronged test really talks to the power of content when it's done best, the power of quality over quantity. And the three-pronged test is, one, does your brand have the discipline to put the utility of its audience ahead of its own utility? Two, does your brand have a sufficiently well-developed story to be able to sustain a consistent flow of content? And three, do you have a long-term commitment to investing in the skills and assets required to consistently deliver content of the highest quality? If all of those things are true, then the it depends becomes a yes. I think you are well positioned as a brand to become a publisher. If the answer to any of those things is no, then I think you sit in that space that's still very valuable, where content is another tool that will help you create better brand engagement. So that's all I wanted to say. I think we're now going to do a panel discussion.